Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with broccoli soup au gratin. That's right, I was eating some French onion soup a while back, and I thought to myself this beautifully brown cheesy crouton would probably be fantastic on other soups, like broccoli for example. So I decided to give it a try, and what followed was exciting and educational, but also upsetting and confusing. So I don't want to give too much away, but let's just say you have a surprise ending to look forward to. Alright, so that should hold you. And in the meantime, we'll go ahead and get started, the same way we start almost all soup recipes, by sauteing a diced onion with some salt in melted butter over medium heat until it starts to soften up and turn translucent, which will take you, about 5 or 6 minutes. But as usual, forget about the time. Just cook those onions stirring until they soften up and sort of look like this. And once that happens, we can go ahead and toss in a couple cloves of minced garlic, and we'll cook that stirring, but only for about a minute. Okay, as usual, we don't want any color on that garlic. So we will saute that garlic in the onions for about 60 seconds, at which point we can go ahead and dump in our cooking liquid, which in my case is going to be chicken broth. Or if you're going vegetarian here, of course you can use veggie stock, whatever that is. And once that's in, what we'll do is raise our heat to high, because we need to bring this up to a simmer before we add our broccoli, which ideally we will prep while waiting for our liquid to come up to a simmer. And what follows is my preferred method for cutting this for soup. All right, what I like to do first is kind of cut off all those florets, since that part of the broccoli cooks a lot faster than the stem. So what I'll do is trim those off, and then possibly cut some of those in half if the stem's still a little big. And then once that's set, we can turn our attention to the much tougher, much thicker stem part, which I like to halve and then quarter, before cutting up in fairly small pieces. In this way, the flower portions of the vegetable aren't going to be way overcooked by the time the stem's tender. And I continued on using that method until I had about 3 pounds of trimmed broccoli, which is about a pound more than I usually use for this soup. But because I was going to finish this au gratin style with that cheesy crouton, I thought it would be a lot better if I made the soup thicker. But anyway, once our broccoli's prepped, assuming our stock has come to a simmer, we can go ahead and transfer that in. And I do realize it looks like I have way too much vegetable and not enough liquid, but it's actually okay, because what I'm going to do with this on high heat is cover it and let it cook for a couple minutes like that until the broccoli kind of softens up a bit and we can really see what we have. So that's what I did, and a few minutes later it looked like this, and I could tell I had just enough liquid. And of course if you don't, you can add a splash. But I determined this to be fine. And what we'll do is reduce our heat to medium-low and simmer that, stirring occasionally for about 10 minutes or so, or until that broccoli is very tender. So this is me about 10 minutes later checking things out, and I could kind of tell just by stirring it was fine. But as you know, we always like a second opinion. So I grabbed a fork and gave it the old poka, and determined yes, it was in fact tender, which means we can turn off the heat and blend this completely smooth, which I'm going to do with a stick blender. But of course, doing it in batches in a traditional blender will work beautifully. Okay, so that took me a few minutes, but eventually I got that nicely pureed. And what we'll do once that's been accomplished is go ahead and add the rest of the ingredients, which will definitely include a nice big splash of heavy cream, as well as we'll do a little touch of freshly grated nutmeg, which is very traditional in a cream-based soup. And there's probably a really good reason for that. We will also do some freshly ground black pepper, as well as the customary shake of cayenne. And then last but not least, a very generous application of salt. And then what we'll do at this point is go ahead and stir that in, while simultaneously returning that to medium-low heat. And as soon as we're confident our soup is nice and hot again, we can go ahead and serve it. But not before tasting for seasoning. And by seasoning, I mostly mean salt. Alright, generally the difference between a good vegetable soup and a great vegetable soup is like a teaspoon of salt. So we're going to need to taste this and almost certainly add some more salt. And once our soup is tasting exactly like we want, and it's come back to temperature, we're pretty much ready to serve. But before we do, we're going to need to make some nice crispy buttered croutons, which I'm going to do in the oven by buttering both sides of a couple pieces of stale bread. And once those slices have been sufficiently slathered, we'll go ahead and pop those into a 375-degree oven until they're nicely browned and crispy. Okay, we want those pretty much cooked all the way through. So those are looking just about perfect right there. And then once our croutons are done and our soup is ready, we can move on to final assembly. So I'm going to use the same pan we did our croutons on, and we will fill up some oven-proof crocks, probably the same ones you use for French onion soup. And we will fill those almost but not quite to the top, because of course we have to leave room for our crouton, which almost fit in, but I had to do a little trimming. But that's okay, we can put those trim pieces along the side. And then once our crocks have been croutoned, we'll go ahead and add our grated cheese over the top. And I'm doing a blend that's like 1/3 Gruyere cheese and 2/3 sharp cheddar. And it looks like I'm being super generous with the cheese, But you'll see this actually melts down to a pretty thin layer. So if you want to put a little more and be even more generous, go ahead. You are, after all, the Dan Fouts of your cheese amounts. But anyway, that looked like a good amount to me. And then what we'll do once our crocs have been croutoned and cheesed is transfer those under the broiler for approximately 5 to 6 minutes, or until our cheese is beautifully browned and bubbly. And because it's pretty common for broilers to have hot spots, I do like to rotate mine after a few minutes. But unfortunately, my oven turns off if I open the door, so I can't show too much of this scintillating footage. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and finish those under a hot broiler until they look a little something like this. Check it out. Man, do those look good. And I could not wait to grab a spoon and get into that. And since we don't need to let these rest, that's exactly what I did. After scattering over a few chives. And I was so excited as I took this first spoonful, which seemed really, really thick. Like I was trying to make it thick, but this was like really, really, really thick. I think partly because it sat for a few minutes while I took pictures, and that crouton sucked in some of the moisture. But also I think that it was just way, way, way too thick. And when I started eating it with the bread, or at least attempting to, I quickly realized this is terrible. This is not good at all. Right, instead of making broccoli soup au gratin, I'd accidentally made wet broccoli bread pudding. And no one's ever walked into a restaurant thinking, man, I hope they have wet broccoli bread pudding today. So at this point I was very disappointed and upset and borderline despondent. So it was clear I had failed spectacularly. But there was no way I was going to let the food win. So having determined the main problem was the soup being too thick, I tried doing another crock, but before I did, I thinned out the soup and passed it through a fine strainer, which not only made this thinner, but significantly improved the texture. And once I'd ladled in my new and improved soup, I went ahead and topped it with the crouton and the cheese as usual. And while it came out pretty much looking the same, it was way, way better, like night and day. Right? By doing a thinner soup, the contrast between that cheesy crouton and creamy liquefied broccoli was way more successful, which isn't saying much because the other one was really terrible. But I actually really did enjoy this, and I felt a lot better that I didn't give up. Of course, appearance-wise, we still have a problem since as soon as you try to eat some of the toast, it still disappears below the surface. But I have an idea to fix that also. By cutting up our bread next time and doing smaller square croutons, then topping it with the cheese, so that we can eat it spoon by spoon without wrecking the whole raft. So that's what I'm going to do next time, if there's a next time. But anyway, that's it. The epic saga of my broccoli soup au gratin comes to an end, with a relatively happy ending. So I really do hope you give this a try soon, with a much thinner soup, and maybe a bunch of small croutons instead of one big one. But either way, head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.